My wife gave birth to 5 children. I can't take care of them.
Amara laid on the examination bed, her hands trembling slightly as the ultrasound screen flickered to life. Lagos traffic noise hummed faintly through the hospital window. But all she could hear was her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The nurse kept shifting the probe across her belly, pausing, adjusting, frowning. Amara's anxiety grew with every silent second. Finally, the doctor entered, gazed at the screen, and froze. He looked from Amara to the monitor and back again, his voice softening as he spoke. Madam, your womb is carrying 5 babies. The words landed like thunder. For a moment, Amara forgot to breathe. Emeka stood beside her, his mouth open, hands on his head, pacing in disbelief. What should have been joy felt like a beginning of something far heavier. 5 babies? At once? Tears filled Amara's eyes, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming reality that their tiny 2 bedroom apartment could barely contain their lives as they already were. On the drive home, Lagos seemed louder, faster, more unforgiving than before. Emeka grabbed the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale, as Amara stared out the window at the sprawling city. She suddenly felt too small inside. Every billboard seemed to advertise diapers, formula, school fees. Every crying child they passed stabbed her with the truth. Their lives were about to change forever. They sat in silence, each drowning in private thoughts. Amara imagined the miracle of holding 5 tiny hands. Emeka imagined Bill stacking so high he couldn't breathe. When they finally arrived home, their neighbor, Mama Ngozi, greeted them with her usual warm smile. But one look at their faces wiped it away. Something heavy had entered their world, and it was only the beginning. The next weeks were a blur of hospital appointments, medical warnings, and a growing sense of helplessness. Every scan came with new instructions: more rest, more tests, more money. The doctor explained the risks: premature labor, breathing complications, financial strain, and every word seemed to scratch another mark on Emeka's spirit. He tried to appear strong, nodding through each consultation, but Amara saw how his shoulders sagged afterwards, how his breathing changed, how his eyes avoided hers when she mentioned the future. At home, the power flickered, the landlord demanded rent, and the refrigerator hummed like a constant reminder of everything they couldn't afford. Amara watched her husband shrink into himself a little more each day, and it frightened her more than the pregnancy itself. Family members had mixed reaction when they shared the news. Some called it a blessing, others whispered about curses or crosses too heavy for young people. Church members prayed for them, but even the prayer sounded strained, like the congregation wasn't sure if this miracle was a gift or a test. Emeka's mom suggested they manage, but with a tone that carried more worry than encouragement. Each new cost, vitamins, hospital deposits, baby items, became an argument waiting to happen. Amara tried to stay hopeful, touching her belly whenever fear threatened to drown her. But every night, when she heard Emeka crying silently into the bathroom, wiping his face before stepping out, she realized her husband was slipping into a darkness she didn't know how to pull him from. By the 7th month, the doctor insisted on bed rest. Amara was admitted into the maternity ward, crowded, warm, and filled with women groaning through contractions. She felt small, fragile, tapped in a bed that wasn't hers, surrounded by stories of struggles that mirrored her own. Emeka visited every day after work, bringing fruits, warm stew, or whatever little thing he could afford. But each time he sat beside her, she felt something shift inside him. His smiles were thinner, his eyes dimmer, his voice hollow. He talked less about baby names and more about expenses, less about the future and more about survival. One afternoon, he confessed he had lost hours at work because he had been leaving early for her hospital runs. Amara held his hands under the blankets, whispering reassurance she barely believed herself. Bills piled up fast. When the hospital demanded another deposit, Emeka froze, staring blankly, as if the numbers were written in a foreign language. Amara wanted to tell him to rest, to breathe, to stop holding the world on his shoulders. But she sensed he was hanging onto sanity by a thread. She watched nurses walk past happy couples and wondered if she could ever feel that joy again. Her body ached and her emotions frail, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had 5 little lives depending on her. Emeka, however, was crumbling under pressure, no one he had prepared him for. Sometimes she woke at night and found him sitting by her bed, head bowed, whispering prayers that sounded more like apologies. The night the storm hit, Lagos transformed into chaos. Thunder cracked like gunshots, lightning splashed against the hospital windows, and rain battered the roof relentlessly. Amara felt a sharp pain rip through her abdomen, one that was nothing like the others. She screamed, grabbing the metal rails of her bed as nurses rushed in. Her water had broken far too early. The world erupted into motion, wheels of stretchers screeching through corridors, midwives calling out instructions, and the storm outside roaring as if competing with her cries. Emeka arrived drenched, breathless, and terrified. He held her hands as doctors pushed her into a labor room, whispering encouragement through trembling lips, even though panic was swallowing him whole. Inside the theater, everything blurred. Lights, bright lights, shouted instructions, metallic clicks of instruments. Amara fought tears, fear, and exhaustion as waves of contractions tore through her. 5 babies, someone whispered. God help her. Hours felt like minutes as doctors worked tirelessly, but the storm outside felt like an omen she couldn't ignore. Emeka wasn't allowed inside, so he paced the hallway in wet clothes, praying, shaking, begging God not to take his wife or children. When the first cry finally pierced the night, he froze, then the second, then the third, the fourth, the fifth. Each cry was a miracle and a warning. He felt joy, yes, but also fear so deep it crept his soul raw. When Amara awoke, exhausted but alive, the world felt unreal. 5 tiny babies laid in incubators, their bodies fragile, like delicate porcelain dolls. Chills ran across their chests. Soft beeping filled the room like a choir of uncertain promises. She rushed and reached out towards them, tears blurring her vision. "They are so small," she whispered. Dr. Dwick assured her they were fighters, but they needed intensive care and constant monitoring. She nodded, swallowing the reality that survival came with costs they could not yet imagine. But at that moment, none of that mattered. She loved them fiercely, with a warmth that filled every crack inside her. Emeka stood beside her, staring at the incubators as though they were 5 mountains he was expected to climb. He tried to smile, but it trembled and faded as quickly as it appeared. He congratulated her, kissed her forehead, whispered something that sounded like hope, but his eyes were filled of fear. He stepped out to get fresh air, but when hours passed and he didn't return, a cold unease settled in Amara's chest. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself he was tired, overwhelmed, emotional. But deep down, a small voice whispered a truth she wasn't ready to hear. Joy had arrived, but left with something else. The storm outside has ended, but a new storm had just begun. When Amara woke the next morning after the delivery, the room felt strangely hollow. The small plastic chair where Emeka had slept for days was empty. His jacket no longer drapes over the armrest. She assumed he had gone to buy breakfast or stepped outside for air, so she focused on gathering her strength, touching her abdomen gently, and whispering silent prayers for her babies in the neonatal unit. Hours passed, and visiting mothers came and went, holding newborn babies wrapped in bright Ankara clothes, their husband hovering protectively. But Amara's husband was nowhere to be seen. When she tried calling him, the phone rang once and then stopped, something he rarely did. Her heart tightened. She told herself he must be overwhelmed. After all, their lives had shifted overnight. Still, the silence pressed in on her, heavy and unsettling. By evening, her worry had settled into her bones. Even Dr. Sadwick noticed her unease, pausing during his rounds of acts to ask whether she had heard from her husband. She forced a smile and lied, claiming he had stepped out. But when the night crept in, the gloom dimmed. Tears finally broke through. She stared at the empty chair, trying to replay his last words, trying to find clues in the turmoil of his words and the way his eyes drifted around the neonatal ward. She remembered how he whispered, "I'll be back," before stepping out. Words that suddenly felt like a farewell disguised as reassurance. Amara clutched the blanket to her chest, afraid to admit even to herself that something was very, very wrong. By the second day, panic bloomed inside her like a wound. Emeka's phone had gone completely off. His workplace confirmed he hadn't shown up. His siblings hadn't heard from him. Neighbors didn't see him return home. Amara's hand shook as she dialed every contact she could think of, her voice cracking with each repeated questions. "Have you seen him?" But all she received were confused purrs and pity-filled sigh. Mama Ngozi hurried to the hospital upon hearing the news, her wrapper tied tightly around her waist as she tried to comfort Amara. But even if she couldn't hide her worries in her eyes, Lagos was a big city, unpredictable and chaotic. People disappeared for many reasons, some intentional, others not. But deep down, Amara knew Emeka had made a choice, and that truth hurt more than the physical pain of childbirth. The hospital social workers spoke with her gently, explaining the protocols when a caregiver is unreachable. Though her words were meant to reassure, every sentence felt like a reminder that she was now standing alone. Amara's mind replayed the past months, the shrinking smile, the unspoken fears. The night he sat silently beside her bed. She had sent him slipping away emotionally, but she never imagined he would disappear physically too. A sharp ache cut through her as she whispered, "He wouldn't leave us. Not like this." But even as she said it, a hollow echo inside her whispered the truth she didn't want to accept. Emeka hadn't been taken. He hadn't collapsed somewhere. He hadn't walked away. Just like that, he had made his choice. And that realization marked the end of the life she once knew. News of quantuplet spread quickly. Nurses shared the story with colleagues. Church members passed it along WhatsApp groups, and within days, strangers began dropping by with donations and prayers. Some arrived with camera phones, wanting to capture the miracle mother, asking questions that felt intrusive and cold. They praised her strength while whispering about the missing husband. In the eyes of the public, she became an inspiration, but inside her, she felt exposed, like someone standing naked in the open while trying to hide her deepest wound. Church elders visited with food supplies and envelopes of small cash contributions, but even their warm smiles were overshadowed by the lingering question no one dared to ask aloud. Why wasn't her husband by her side? Gossip started trickling in. Some assumed Emeka had run because he couldn't handle the pressure. Some blamed Amara, suggesting she had overwhelmed the man with too many expectations. A few were sympathetic, but sympathy wasn't what she wanted. She wanted answers. She wanted closure. She wanted her babies alive and her husband present. At night, she cried silently so the other mothers wouldn't hear. She buried her shame deep, knowing she couldn't afford to fall apart, not with her five fragile lives depending on her. Yet each time she looked at the incubators, she felt both love and fear twist inside her. The world celebrated her miracle, but no one understood the price she was paying to hold herself together. When the babies were finally moved from the incubator to her world, Amara realized motherhood wasn't just love, it was labor, exhaustion, and a constant fight against fear. She barely slept. The babies cried at alternating times, tiny fleets waving, long, small but determined. Feeding them became a full time job. Changing diapers felt endless. She often found herself shaking from fatigue, leaning against the metal frame of the bed, whispering prayers for strength. Nurses helped when they could, but the hospital was overcrowded, and most mothers had only one child to care for, not five. Amara's hand blistered from constant movement. Her back ached, and her emotions teetered on the edge. Sometimes she stared at them and wondered how she was supposed to do this alone. That was when Mama Ngozi became her anchor. The elderly woman arrived each morning with warm pap, homemade soup, and stories meant to lighten Amara's heart. She bathed the babies, massaged their tiny arms and legs, and encouraged Amara to sleep even if only for 30 minutes. God no go shame you, she repeatedly, endlessly, and slowly told Amara. Amara began to believe it. She learned to smooth through babies at once, to rock another with her feet, to carry one on her chest while feeding another. Her life narrowed into a circle of care, but in that circle, she found small victories. Each steady breath from her babies, each smooth and soft coo, each moment they opened their eyes and looked at her as if they already knew she was their entire world. And maybe she was. After discharge, reality hit harder than any storm. The landlord demanded arrears. The electricity bill was overdue. The fridge hummed with emptiness. The babies needed clothes, formula, diapers, everything Emeka once promised to provide. Amara sold most of her belongings, keeping only the utensils and essentials. She washed clothes for neighbors, braided children's hair for small fees, and leaned heavily on Mama Ngozi's guidance. Despite her pride, she accepted charity from the church because survival mattered more than ego. But every morning, when she sat on the mattress with all her five babies nestled around her, she felt the weight of abandonment settle like a stone in her chest. She kept hoping Emeka would walk through the door, apologize, explain, but the hope slowly became grief. Days turned into weeks. Her resilience grew muscles she never knew she had. She learned to stretch small amounts of money, to multitask like a machine, to fight exhaustion with sheer willpower. But beneath the surface of her strength was a quiet, steady ache. She missed companionship. She missed help. She missed having someone to share burdens with. Sometimes she felt anger rising, a burning fury, as the man who had left her to weather a storm they created together. Yet, in the still moments, she also felt pity for him because while she had been forced to grow, to bloom in hardship, Emeka had shrunk into fear and disappeared. And now, Amara was no longer the woman she waited for rescue. She was the woman who learned to carry five lives alone. Life shifted unexpectedly the day Amara met Tunde Adeyemi, the founder of his small NGO focused on supporting vulnerable mothers in Lagos. Tunde had heard her story from a church member and personally came to see her, expecting to meet someone broken and helpless. Instead, he found a tired but fiercely determined woman, balancing five toddlers with a grace that startled him. He sat in her small living room, surrounded by scattered toys and laundry, and listened as she narrated the months after Emeka vanished, her voice steady, her eyes guided. Something about her strengthening energy unsettled him, not because it was intimidating, but because it revealed how deeply she had learned to survive alone. Tunde offered structural assistance, medical support for the children, food stipends, and for vocational training so she could rebuild her life sustainably. Amara hesitated, accepting help felt like exposing her vulnerability, but the sight of her children sleeping on tiny mats pushed her to swallow her pride. As weeks passed, Tunde's NGO became a lifeline. Amara enrolled in a skill program, learning to make children's clothing, a skill that blossomed into a small business. Tunde visited occasionally, always professional, always respectful, yet unable to hide the admiration slowly forming in his eyes. He watched her transform from a woman barely staying afloat to a woman envisioning a future beyond survival. Still, he remained cautious. Amara carried invisible wounds, abandonment, betrayal, exhaustion, and he feared stepping into a space she wasn't ready to share. For Amara, Tunde's presence was confusing. He was kind, dependable, and steady. Everything she once wished Emeka would be, but she wasn't ready for emotional possibilities. Not yet. Her life was still anchored to the past, even if she no longer waited for Emeka to return. 2 years later, the small apartment that once felt like a cage now buzzed with possibilities. Amaka's children, now energetic toddlers, filled the home with laughter and chaos, their voices blending into a soundtrack of healing she had learned to cherish. The clothing business she started with Tunde's support had grown steadily. Neighbors, churches, and even schools now placed orders. For the first time in years, she was able to save money, plan meals without counting every coin, and dream without guilt. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman reshaped by fire, leaner, fiercer, softer in some ways, but unbreakable in others. She no longer introduced herself as the woman whose husband ran away. She now carried a new title quietly in her heart, Mother Who Survived. Despite the progress, life was not without its pangs. Some nights, when the children crawled around her like veins seeking warmth, she felt a lingering ache of loss, not for Emeka, but for the vision of herself she once believed love alone could hold a family together. She sometimes wondered where he was, whether he thought of them, or whether shame had swallowed him whole. But those thoughts no longer controlled her. Tunde remained a distant but reliable presence, never intruding, offering help only when asked. He admired her silently from the edge, knowing she still carried emotional scars she wasn't ready to expose. Amara had rebuilt her identity not around a man's presence, but around her own resilience, and that more than anything marked the beginning of her rebirth. While Amara built her world, Emeka lived in the shadows of his mistakes, drifting from town to town in the southeast, taking odd jobs to survive. Guilt had carved deep lines into his face, and sleepless nights haunted him with memories of tiny infants breathing through tubes. He convinced himself he wasn't worthy of being a father, that his abandonment had already sealed his fate as a failure. In long, lonely evenings, he imagined going back, falling on his knees, and begging for forgiveness. But shame kept chaining him to silence. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes judging him, even when no one knows his story. He worked in a mechanic shop for months, saved barely enough to survive, and lived with the constant fear that the world would eventually find out who he really was. But the universe doesn't hide stories forever. One afternoon, Emeka overheard a radio program discussing the miracle mother of Lagos raising quadruplets alone. The announcer mentioned her strength, her business, and the NGO supporting her. Emeka froze, his heart thundering. The world was celebrating the woman he abandoned. The children he feared he couldn't raise were not just surviving, they were thriving without him. That realization broke something inside him. He wept openly, his body shaking with a grief he had carried alone for years. In that moment, he understood that running had protected no one. It had only buried him deeper in regret. For the first time since he disappeared, he whispered a promise into the empty room. I will go home. But returning meant facing the woman who no longer needed him and the children who no longer knew his name. Amara didn't see him the first time he walked past her shop. She was busy arranging tiny dresses on a wooden rack while her children played in the corner. When Emeka stopped across the street, watching from the shadows, his breath caught at the sight of the family he once feared. The children were lively, healthy, laughing, so different from the fragile beings he remembered. And Amara, she was radiant, stronger, confident. Her smile, once timid and tired, now carried purpose. Seeing her like that made youth slice through him like a blade. She had built a world without him, a world better than the one he ever offered. She's He stayed rooted to the ground, unsure whether he had the right to step forward or if approaching her would only reopen wounds she had spent years healing. Their eyes finally met when she looked up from her sewing machine. The color drained from her face, replacing by a mixture of shock, anger, and something he couldn't recognize. The fabric slipped from her hands as memory collides with the present. The children paused and looked at him curiously. Emeka felt his knees weakened. He stepped forward slowly, hands trembling, lips quivering around words he had rehearsed 1,000 times. Amara, I I came back. Was but his return was not a triumphant moment. It was an unwelcome shadow falling over a life she painstakingly rebuilt. She didn't rush to him. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stared, her voice low and steady. Why now? In that moment, he realized forgiveness wouldn't come easy. If it came at all, Amara agreed to speak with him privately, not for herself, but for the children who deserved to know the truth about their father. They met in the small living room that once held their dreams and disappointments. Emeka knelt before her, confessing everything, the fear, the shame, the overwhelming sense of inadequacy that had consumed him. His words spilled out in fragments, trembling between regret and desperation. Amara listened quietly, her hands folded on her lap, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she inhaled deeply. You didn't just leave me, Emeka. You left your children. You left a vision of life you could have built together. No matter how hard, her voice cracked but didn't break. She had cried enough in the past. Today, she wanted truth more than tears. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't an emotion, it was a decision. One that didn't require reconciliation. She could forgive him without reopening the doors he had closed. So she told him gently, I forgive you, but we cannot go back. Emeka wept, accepting the consequences of his choices. Amara placed a hand on his shoulder, not in love, but in closure. She had grown beyond the woman he abandoned. She had become a mother forged in fire, a woman whose strength no longer needed another person to validate it. The children peeped from the hallway, unsure of who he was, and Amara walked towards them with calm hearts, knowing their future would be brighter, not because he returned, but because she had learned to raise without him. For Amara, Forgiveness meant releasing the weight of the past. For Emeka, it meant learning to live with the echo of a life he could never reclaim.